Joining me right now is the former Council of Economic Advisors chairman under President Obama, Jason Furman. Jason, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So this would be a 10% increase to the Pentagon's projected budget, and yet you still hear people like John McCain saying it's not enough, we need more spending. Your take on what you heard from the president the other night with regard to military spending?
I'm no expert on defense spending, but what worries me is that this is being paid for by gutting everything else in the government. If we want to have good jobs in this country, we're going to need to invest in education. We're going to need to invest in scientific research. That's the part of the budget that's getting whacked to pay for this defense increase.
But, you know, people were asking, though, look, obviously we have issues in terms of our military. You've got the Navy fleet, the Army fleet, oldest in decades. We had General Jack Keane on the show yesterday, basically painting a picture of we are not prepared for much in terms of the military right now. Why wasn't an increase in defense spending projected or expected under the Obama administration?
Well, we proposed the same thing. Understand what this is all relative to. There was a sequester put in place in 2010, and this was meant to be a really brutal mechanism to force both sides to come to the table and come to an agreement with cuts that were untenable in both defense and non-defense. Unfortunately, we never came to an agreement, so what we've been doing is about 2 years at a time patching it. And we had proposed a solution that would have had higher defense spending and higher non-defense spending paid for with a combination of savings in entitlements and revenue. That's the real way we should be doing this. That's the path that Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission had set out years ago, for example.
So you do think then an increase in defense spending is warranted?
I think it almost certainly is warranted. I just don't know what the exact number should be.
Understood.
But what I think, I used to get pressed all the time on what are we doing about entitlements, what are we doing about entitlements. This is an administration which appears to have taken them off the table, at least the middle class entitlements. They're paying for...
President Obama never did anything about the entitlements.
We did substantial savings in Medicare as part of the Affordable Care Act. We did a delivery system reform for doctors on a bipartisan basis with Congress in 2015 and had additional proposals beyond that. If you take it off the table entirely, it forces these types of really big cuts on medical research, on education, on everything else.
What do you think about the idea of what's being talked about now, and that is a so-called border tax or a reciprocal tax, where you're talking about a money raise of $1 trillion over 10 years? Do you see viability in cutting taxes the way the president wants to do, but also raising revenue by that tax, the border tax?
First of all, I think the starting point of business tax reform should be we need a more competitive system. That probably means lower rates. And we shouldn't get there by making another one of our problems, which is the deficit, even worse. So we should have revenue-neutral tax reform. This is what Ronald Reagan did. This is what many on both sides have called for in Congress. This border tax is something that's really attractive to tax policy nerds, and the tax policy nerd in me loves it. But then I look at the real-world consequences and how much the exchange rate would move, how much that would change asset values, raise the value of what China owns, lower the value of what we own, the WTO reprisals, and I get pretty nervous that we haven't thought through the transition enough.
So you don't love it?
I think it's not ready for prime time. I wish it was, because it's attractive in some ways, but I don't think they've thought it through well enough.
Now, one thing that they're thinking through is the idea of economic growth, and they feel that this economic team feels that economic growth, if you get to 4%, that cures a lot of ails. Now, we just got the jobless claims numbers out. They came in at 223,000. That is a 44-year low, lower than any of the expectations on jobless claims. People are wondering, how are you going to move the needle on economic growth? Do you buy into that idea that economic growth will cure ills?
I think absolutely. The most important thing we need in this country is more productivity growth. We've had a big productivity slowdown over the last 10, 15 years. We need to get our productivity growth up, business tax reform, trade, public investment. There's a range of things we can do. What I think is a problem, though, is if you build your budget on rosy scenarios and wishful thinking, you shouldn't do that. So let's try to get as much growth as we can, but then be conservative in our projections so that we're not fooling ourselves into thinking we can afford tax cuts and defense spending increases that we can't really afford as a country.
The president has been talking a lot about job creation. That's been his goal. How's he doing so far, Jason?
Look, first of all, most of the job creation in this country had nothing to do with President Obama. It has nothing to do with President Trump. It's what the private sector does, and the private sector has been doing a good job of job creation.
Well, wait a
in this
minute. The
country.
private sector is going to make decisions based on policy around them. I mean, a lot of people will say that because of the regulatory environment under the Obama years, business sat on cash, and that's why they didn't actually put money to work and hire new people. So, yeah, the business sector is going to do what it's going to do, but they're going to do it based on what the policy is. We know that.
Well, the policy matters, absolutely, and the policy contributed to the longest streak of private sector job growth that our country's ever had, an unemployment rate that consistently fell further and faster than any private forecasters expected. Right now, you have a lot of optimism in the economy. You don't have a lot of policy to justify that optimism. Maybe that policy is going to come. I think a lot of it is unlikely to, because it's going to get blocked in Congress, because it won't be proposed, or because you'll have, some crazy things happening on trade or immigration or something else that will actually hurt our economy. So I'm a little bit worried about what happens when you sort of gone out over this cliff, look down, and see nothing's beneath you.